Hello, everyone. I'm Andrew Dick. I'm the Connected, Automated, and Electric Vehicle Advisor for the Oregon Department of Transportation. Thank you, Lauren, for the great introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the way that state governments are responding to this new technology around the country, and then specifically the efforts that Oregon Department of Transportation has underway. All right, so first off, what are the benefits of AVs that are of interest to public agencies? What are we trying to achieve? We see a lot of safety benefits. About 90% of crashes, 5 to 6 million of them in the US annually, are caused by driver error. They're caused by people who aren't paying attention or who lose control of the vehicle or who otherwise cause a crash. That causes about 35,000 traffic deaths annually, and more than 400 of those are in Oregon. So we really, from the safety perspective, see the opportunity to leverage these technologies in a way that causes these vehicles to be more safe. Secondly, mobility. We want people to be able to get around. There are people who are constrained in their mobility because they are low income or because they are disabled or because they live far away from city centers or other places that they want to go. And driverless vehicles would give them more mobility. Efficiency in the environment. Coordinated vehicles can accelerate at the same time, they can brake at the same time. You have less gridlock, you have a more efficient use of the transportation system, and with that you have less time idling and less time stuck in traffic, and so you have less emissions. And basically just improved operation of the network overall. If you have vehicles that are all communicating to each other and optimizing traffic flows, you see a lot less congestion and so on. But AVs also have associated risks that we need to manage as a government agency. The safety of the autonomous driving systems is one. How do you know that the vehicles are safe? Computer security and data privacy. You may have seen the sort of high-profile hacking of a Jeep. It was a white hat hacker, so everybody knew that test was going on, but really it was to prove that computer systems in vehicles right now have so much control over their operation that if somebody with malicious intent gets into those systems, they can really take control of that vehicle in a way that might be dangerous. Changing demands on transportation agencies. This is a risk for us as an organization because we need to be prepared for what's coming. We need to understand what these vehicles are going to need out of the transportation system, like machine-readable infrastructure, in order to operate safely on our roads. And lastly, will we have increased travel demand? Will we have zero occupancy VMT? Those were a couple issues that Lauren talked about, but we've been so concerned about moving people to these multimodal systems, public transit, trying to get people out of single occupancy vehicles. But we're actually raising the specter of moving to zero occupancy VMT and potentially quite a bit of it if we don't manage the deployment of these vehicles well. So the question is, how do we prepare for AVs in a way where we can mitigate those risks but capture all the great benefits that we think this technology can provide? So I'm going to go through some of the different approaches that states have put into practice so far. It's worth noting that many states at this point are waiting for guidance from NHTSA on a policy framework for AVs. Oregon is one among many states that actually had a bill on autonomous vehicles in its legislature in the past couple sessions, and then was urged by Google and was urged by the other automotive manufacturers to hold off on establishing yet another framework for AV testing. The concern is that there is a patchwork of regulations emerging, and as Lauren said, it becomes an issue if you have a vehicle that's licensed only in one state, but not in another state, and then not in another state. So, generally we like to have sort of harmonized guidelines for technology that can be used across the country, harmonized guidelines for vehicles that can be sold in different states, and for the types of infrastructure that are in different states, so any vehicles and drivers can operate there. But there are some states that do have testing underway. Other states are looking at encouraging new testing. And so some of those are passing AV legislation or taking other governmental action in order to support that testing. So what are the state responsibilities in regulating these technologies? Well, different states have had sort of different philosophical approaches to this in terms of, what is the role of the state at this point? What should the state require of people who are trying to operate these vehicles on the roads? So here's a map of states with enacted autonomous vehicle legislation to date. Some of these are very sort of minor at this point. For instance, North Dakota and Utah have just passed legislation saying that there needs to be a study of how these technologies will impact them. Tennessee passed a law saying that local governments couldn't make laws prohibiting AVs. And then this year sort of expanded on that a little bit. Louisiana and DC have just added a definition of an autonomous vehicle or automated driving. One of the interesting things about the driving codes in most of the states is that nobody ever specified that a human had to be the driver because it wouldn't have occurred to them back when they were being written. So there are problems just with definitions, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. So the remaining states here, Florida, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada, California, they're all actually sort of implementing a scheme that relates to automated vehicle testing and different ways of regulating them. So I'm going to zero in on California first and give a sense of how they've approached this issue. So going back all the way to 2012, the California legislature passed a bill directing their Department of Motor Vehicles to develop regulations surrounding automated vehicles. They divided it into two phases. There's a testing and the operations phase. We're not quite to the operations phase yet, so these are the requirements for the testing phase. First, if you're a manufacturer, you have to apply to DMV for a vehicle testing permit. You need to register your automated vehicle. You have to show your proof of ownership. You have to give a description of the automated vehicle technology. You need third-party certification of vehicle safety. So you need to get an outside entity that has knowledge of the California Vehicle Code and safety systems and the automated systems and so on to provide verification that your vehicle safety system can operate correctly. You need $5 million insurance requirements so that if anything happens to go wrong with the vehicle, you know that you can cover the damages. You need an event data recorder to record info on the automated vehicle system, and then there are many additional reporting requirements. You have to report accidents, disengagements of the AV system, make these publicly available, make them available to the state as well, so that any incident relating to the vehicle is reported. You need a driver in the driver's seat who's able to take control of the vehicle, which effectively, as Lauren said, translated into a requirement that you have a steering wheel, brake pedal, accelerator in the vehicle, which some manufacturers didn't actually want to do. And so on. There are other requirements as well, driver licensing and so on. So I'm going to contrast that with Texas's approach to this, which is basically come on down. Texas actually wasn't on that map. They haven't made any laws surrounding AVs, and so when Google started to develop their second round prototype, you see this is their first round prototype. This is a modified Lexus SUV, so it has all the original controls in it in terms of a steering wheel and brakes and so on. But when Google started to develop their second round vehicle, which does not have a steering wheel or brakes, they took it to Austin, and that's where they're doing the testing. And Google's philosophy on that is really that it's a liability if you ever have a situation where there's confusion about whether the driver should or should not be in control of the vehicle. What happens to Lauren's driver who's asleep in his blue Tesla if suddenly traffic picks up and suddenly everybody's moving 55 miles an hour, or suddenly the road conditions change, or you approach a situation that's unsafe? Google said we should never have that sort of confusion, or even the potential for that confusion about whether or not there's a driver or not a driver in control of the vehicle. So they've taken that to Texas, where they can do more testing with that concept. So some of the short-term policy questions, just to generalize about what California was asking and what other states are asking. How do you determine that vehicles are safe? A lot of times states don't actually have a role in determining the safety of systems. Most states, especially smaller states, really aren't staffed in a way that you can have experts who can make that determination. So typically that is regulated by the federal government. What vehicles are allowed? Who can operate them? California came up with this, you need registration, you need certification and so on, you need licensed drivers. Eventually though, you might need you might be able to put your kids in a driverless vehicle because, why should they even be required to have a driver's license if they're not going to do any driving? Does a human need to be able to intervene? At least in the short term, this is something that's been put into practice in a lot of the testing regimes. is that you need to have somebody, even if they're not physically in the vehicle, able to take control should the system fail. Another question is, what constitutes a driver? Does an AV system constitute a driver? Well, NHTSA wrote a letter to Google saying that it does. But that starts to cause conflicts with existing law. For instance, in New York, there's a requirement that a driver have one hand on the wheel at all times, which is difficult if you don't have hands. There are other requirements that, for instance, that drivers report accidents. So a vehicle can't maybe directly report an accident. And then many states have requirements that if a vehicle is in a collision, the driver needs to stay at the scene and then render aid. So you can imagine an automated vehicle trying to be useful after a collision. So there actually are substantial sections of driver codes that states need to look at and potentially revise as this technology approaches sort of widespread deployment, and we need to resolve those conflicts. Who's liable if an AV crashes? We mentioned that before. And then lastly, one of the interesting ones is, how do you ensure that AV regulation doesn't outpace technology development? And so the question there is, if you work with maybe one manufacturer and they come to you and they have a great technology and you put into practice a regulatory scheme that's very specific to that technology and requires certain performance characteristics or vehicle characteristics that just relate to that one test, then what happens when someone else comes along with a different technology that doesn't fit into that framework? If you put yourself in the position of having to completely reopen your framework every time a new technology comes out, then that can be an enormous burden. In the longer term, agencies have even more questions that we're going to be really interested in addressing. So what are the impacts on VMT? We've heard projections that VMT could go up, that VMT could go down, depending on what the degree of sharing and how people are using the vehicles. Whether people will tolerate longer trips, if there are effects on urban growth and commute distances, if people can be using their time productively when they're sitting in an automated vehicle, then maybe they'll tolerate living 50 miles outside where they work, and they'll just work on the way into the city. How are autonomous vehicles going to impact employment? This is an issue that came up in some discussions with our legislature is this going to create a bunch of engineering jobs for Oregon? Is it going to be a boon for employment? Is there a way that we can use this in a way that supports economic development in the state? And then on the other side, what does this mean for truck drivers? What does this mean for taxi cab drivers? What does this mean for everyone who earns a living that way and it could become another sector where people see that their jobs are replaced by automation? And then how are AVs going to change expectations of transportation agencies is another one. Maintaining infrastructure that can be read by vehicles. ODOT is represented on a committee that designs uniform traffic control devices. So it makes sure that stop signs and pavement markings and so forth are identical from state to state, or at least within similar tolerances. And in the future, if you have automated vehicles that need to be able to read the infrastructure and their sensors need a specific configuration or specific materials, then we need to be aware of that. Again, the agency might have a much bigger role in data analysis, in deploying roadside infrastructure, in looking at real-time traffic information and doing active traffic management based on the data that we're collecting. This is a really interesting transition for transportation agencies because historically, you go out, you collect some data, you bring it back, you build a model. And then you look at your system sort of from this modeling standpoint and try to figure out how you can address transportation challenges based on this data that you collected at a specific point in time. In the future, we're going to be collecting so much data in real time that we're really going to be moving towards a different operational paradigm where we don't come back and do a bunch of analysis and then go out and make changes, but where we can actually modify the system in order to improve operations in real time. But that's a shift for the agency and a move towards data analysis and data management in a way that hasn't been a focus maybe of a lot of transportation agencies to date. What does safety and incident response look like in a world of crashless cars? So, we might need to staff up on network engineers and on data analysts and so on. But at the same time, if we eliminate 90% of our crashes, then we might have much less of a role in safety and incident response because we'll have so many fewer incidents to respond to. So all of this results in the need for a lot of workforce development. As Lauren said, there's something new about this in the papers or online every day. And really what we want to do as an agency is ensure that our staff is hearing it from us before they're hearing it from outside, so that they understand that we have a plan surrounding this. They understand sort of how the agency's role might change, and so that they're prepared and that they gain the skills for acting in those new capacities. So ODOT's approach specifically, we've created a connected and automated vehicle steering team. We have high-level staff from different agency divisions. So we have people from transportation safety. We have people from intelligent transportation systems. We engage with the Oregon State Police, our long-term planning, basically just everyone across the agency where these technologies might have an impact. And we really sort of concluded that it is agency-wide. They come to this steering team so we can sort of exchange information and talk through how different things might affect agency operations. We review upcoming connected vehicle and automated vehicle technologies, put together tools where we can sort of analyze them and look at what they might look like in the state of Oregon, identify the impacts on different segments of the agency, and identify impacts on operations and if there are any consequences to the safety of the system. From that, we determine research and pilot priorities. We figure out if there are ways that we can get hands-on experience, or if we need research projects to learn more about what the impacts might be. And then we use that information to manage our internal and external outreach and education. So not just doing workforce development for the folks who are working for ODOT, but also engaging with the public, letting them know what these technologies are, how the agency is responding to them, and that there are paradigms in place to ensure the safety of the system. And using all of that, we sort of build this plan for how the agency will evolve in response to the technology. So I'm going to look at just one technology and a couple of the tools that we have built to analyze that and how it might impact the system, which is truck platooning. Truck platooning is already being tested in Nevada. I think it's about to be tested in a couple other states in the US. It's undergone extensive testing in Europe. And the idea between truck platooning is that two trucks use wireless communications and coordinate their accelerating, braking, sometimes their turning, in order to make sure that they can safely operate much more closely than you normally could. So you have trucks driving almost about 36 feet apart at highway speeds. This improves aerodynamics for both trucks. You have the leading truck is clearing a path for the one behind it. There's less wind resistance, and there end up being about 5% fuel savings for the lead truck and 10% fuel savings for the trailing truck. And in the context of the U.S. motor carrier industry, which spends over $100 billion a year on fuel, there could be a powerful motivator for economic development here. We were talking with one company that said, when we're interested in developing efficiency improvements to our vehicles, to our trucks, we're at the point where we're trying to get sometimes fractions of a percent. We're looking at 0.3%, 0.1% in terms of what that technology could do. And so a 7% increase in fuel savings is really substantial. It's an order of magnitude bigger than a lot of the savings that manufacturers typically look at when they try to increase efficiency. But what does that mean for Oregon? How do we ensure safety? We look at the way that these operate on our roadways, and we try to think about the consequences in terms of how other road users are going to interact with that technology. So the earlier image I showed you was just sort of two trucks. But this is a test that happened in the Netherlands, where you have more than a dozen trucks in a platoon. And if you can imagine, if you were trying to get on or get off of a freeway while this was passing, that would be very difficult. It could be just blocked for a mile. So there's a question, how do we ensure that vehicles will safely be able to come on or leave the freeway? What stretches of the roadway do we allow platooning? At what times of day? In what weather conditions? Do we want to allow this at rush hour in Portland where the interchanges are very close together? Do we want to allow it in more rural settings where the interchanges are further apart? Another one is bridge loading. Does this cause greater bridge loading than our current triple trailers? So we looked into that and found that platoons of up to 4 fully loaded semis would be able to go across all the bridges in Oregon that don't have weight restrictions on them currently. So here's an example of a GIS tool that we're building. This is the number of lanes. So this is one potential strategy that we thought we might use to address the impact of truck platooning on the highway. If people are having trouble getting on or off that rightmost lane, maybe you restrict the use of these to areas that are yellow or better. Areas that are yellow are areas where you have at least 3 lanes on the highway. You could restrict that platooning trucks only use the middle lane, and so you have the passing lane on the left and you have the sort of empty lane on the right that stays open for vehicles that are getting on or off. This is one that shows the distance between interchanges. And so you can see that if you get into a more urban area like Salem, they get a lot closer together. Orange and red mean that they're, I think, less than 3 miles apart. But if you get down south of Salem and into the area between Salem and Eugene, you start to get much longer stretches of highway. So that's another way of addressing that merging question, which is that if you have much longer distances between interchanges, there's less of a chance that a vehicle is coming on, depending on your traffic patterns, at the same time that a platoon would be passing. So we have a number of ongoing efforts. We just want to keep tracking development of AV technology. We do that just, not only just by reading the news and so on, but also by engaging with other states and national efforts on AV deployment. So we work a lot with AASHTO, the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. They lead a lot of great information sharing forums where different states can compare notes on what they're thinking about. AMVA is the equivalent to that for motor vehicle administrations. We're also participating in the National Cooperative Highway Research Project, which has a project surrounding connected and automated vehicles, which is doing some sort of forward-thinking research into the way that these vehicles will be used in our system. We're building relationships with stakeholders. At this point, ODOT really doesn't have a formal role. As I mentioned earlier, we were one of those states where creating our own testing paradigm was discouraged. So at this point, we don't have a formal role in approving or disapproving these technologies. So we have a role in building relationships so that we can have a back and forth with a company that wants to do something in Oregon, and we can work through those safety and operational issues even if we're not the regulating agency at this point in time. And then lastly, we just want to develop strategies to ensure that ODOT is responsive to these new technologies, that we're prepared for their deployment, but that we're also responsible in our mission of preserving public safety. So thank you very much. There's my contact information. And with that, I'll pass it over to Ashley.